St. JW redeemed a story about Kansas. Okay. And an NPR voice. God, now I have to think of a story about Kansas that I can do in an NPR voice. What's a good story about Kansas? Did I ever tell you guys about the Count the Bolts promotion? I guess I can set it up with an NPR voice. So imagine, if you will, a town, Bunker Hill, Kansas. In it, a small station struggling with the knowledge that soon the digital transition will happen. Then, out of the blue, funding arrives, and the station is able to build a large antenna so that it can start broadcasting in digital. This is a story of Count the Bolts. So my boss at the time, who was terrible, you might recall that from a different story in which he slapped me, wanted to build up hype about the new digital tower we were building. If you're a little baby young'un, you might not realize that it used to be that a TV signal went out with an analog signal so that analog TVs could pick it up. Eventually, the FCC said, at this time, you have to change your signal to digital. Part of that was some stations had to build a new digital antenna because they only had antenna that could produce an analog signal. So the little tiny station that I was working with, first off got an extension, but then afterwards got funding to build a tower. So again, my terrible boss wanted to build hype about this tower. He wanted everybody to know that the tower was coming and that we were going to be broadcasting in digital and it was going to be glorious. Things that people in Kansas do not care about, not even a little bit. So the way that he did it was he tried to get involved kids and have this thing called Count the Bolts. And he said that he had worked out the number of bolts. And so we started doing these hints, right? So it's like, okay, here's your Count the Bolts hint number 1. Each guy wire is held down by 3 bolts on top and 3 bolts at the bottom. And there are so many guy wires, right? So it's like, okay, your kids figure it out. It's like each section of this has so many bolts and there are so many sections of this. It's like, okay, all right, trying to figure it out. So this went on for a very long time. It was like months of these Count the Bolts hints. The thing keeps going. He keeps giving more hints. And I know this because I was the one who was making these promos, right? He wrote them, but I was having a voice actor voice them, and I was editing them together using footage that people have gotten from the tower construction and other footage that I could, hope to use. A lot of graphics because, at first there wasn't a tower there to shoot. And even when there was somewhat of a tower there to shoot, it's just like a static half-built tower, right? Nothing's happening. So anyway, it keeps going, and I assumed at that point, I'm like, yeah, somebody is keeping track of this and being like, okay, I have this, and I have this, and I have this. And then the final hint came down. And the final hint was, so in addition to everything you've already worked out, there are anywhere between like 20 and 100 more bolts, right? So you couldn't figure it out. Yeah. You'd have to guess. Like the last one was like, now guess a number between like 20 and 100 and hope that you get it right. I remember when I looked at that and he gave it to me, I'm like, I had that same response. I responded just like Skippy. I was like, what? And he's like, yeah, they just have to guess or whatever. And I'm like, but we've been saying, like, there's a prize. Like, there's a prize involved. Like, somebody's going to get a prize for figuring this out. We can't just make them guess because then it would be arbitrary. Also, people that have been doing the math this long are going to be upset. And he's like, that's how he was. Like, yeah, well, it's fine. And I'm like, okay. So I put it on. Oh yeah, that's the other one, is that we were running 2 different contests for it. One of them was for individuals and one of them was for classrooms. So we were trying to get classrooms for kids that were learning like arithmetic or whatever to make their guesses, and we were going to give them something like a pizza party or something dumb, but still. So it's like we had gotten classrooms involved in doing this. Horseman says he thought there were hundreds of kids vying for it. He thought that he had to keep it competitive. My dude failed at game design. Right, exactly. Yeah, so here's how it turned out. One day he comes in and he's like, hey, these kids are coming in because they won the Count the Bolts thing and we want to get some promotional stuff. And I'm like, this classroom won? And he's like, well, this is the only classroom that entered. And they got it wrong, but we don't have to tell them. And I'm like, well, of course they got it wrong. First off, of course, this was the only classroom because we're a tiny rural station and there aren't that many classrooms that get us anyway. But also, I'm glad that you removed the specification that they had to get the answer right because there was no way to get the answer right. I don't remember if it was 20 and 100. It might be like 1 and like 300, right? It was like a huge spread, a big enough spread that like you couldn't possibly guess it right. And you couldn't make an educated guess either because these were extra bolts throughout the whole tower for like different sort of safety things and things like that, right? So it's like, yeah, I'm glad you decided, hey, they don't have to get it right because otherwise we would have gotten nobody. So anyway, the kids came in, took a picture, they got some prizes. Like most of the things we were doing were good for the community. Count the Bolts was a freaking joke. But yeah, at least those kids got to go home with some books. That's the story of Count the Bolts. It was like one of the first promotions that I did for the station that I was working at in Kansas and for this guy. And like afterwards, like there were just so many things where I was like, what is up with this guy? Skip says, I'm going to tell him. I really want to tell him. Well, this was a long time ago. So I'm sure all of those kids are out of school now. So you'd have to track each individual student of Mrs. Whatever's like 6th grade class and tell each of them. Malone says we should track down those students and tell them, hey, that dude in Kansas lied to you. Just get free stuff for showing up. Suffer. Like you thought you were smart. You've built your career on lies. You thought one time you figured out how many bolts there were in a tower. You didn't. There was no way of knowing. It was a Kobayashi Maru of counting the bolts. There was no way to win. Richie says, I just think it's cute that the kids tried. Yeah, they tried. They had no idea. They had no idea that they were set up for failure. Yeah, he never told us. He never told me the actual number that he had in mind. But that's the thing is like, he also must have guessed that number, right? He had the same information that the rest of us had. So he also guessed and decided that his guess was right. I just can't. I remember I'm like, why did any of this happen? Why did any of this happen? You know? And it's like just because this guy got excited about the tower and he wanted to make a big promotion out of it. Yeah, video is over. Don't forget to like them, subscribe them, and give that bell a ring-a-ling so you don't miss a thing.